I am Dr. Merlin Seller. I am based here in Edinburgh as well, lecturer in design screen cultures, University of Edinburgh, where my research focuses on visuality with an interest in non-human and queer studies, and often phenomenology and horror. These are the opening lines of the game Control. It's like we live in a dark room and there's a poster on the wall. We stare at it and think that's the whole world, but the room's a cell. The world is much bigger and stranger. There's a hole hidden behind the poster. Quote Brutalist, we've been living in a tiny prison of our own devising, one in which all that concerns us are the fleshy beings that are our kindred. And Seaver, sand is a tracer of all the movements, fast and slow, of the Earth's materials as they change their surroundings and produce the scenery of our lives. This paper reads the third-person shooter, Control, 2019, Remedy Entertainment, through cultural, historical, and new materialist lenses as a prison of sand, concerned with the strangeness of things. Textual analysis will hopefully unpack the historical-ontological interactions of concrete and its sandy substrate as an agentic, haunting material. This is a game centered on a secretive federal bureau inhabiting an ineffably ancient and non-Euclidean structure called the oldest house, made from concrete, where everyday items contain spatio-temporal powers, and we fight a noise from another dimension that's possessed its office workers, so an average Thursday. Remedy's output has been largely ignored by scholarship so far, beyond some mentions of Max Payne's Bullet Time and Quantum Break's transmediality, but represents as a corpus a sustained interest in supernatural thrillers set in the United States, and what Mark Fisher would call eerie, opaque agency, interrupting the familiar. I used this case study as a cement mixer to aggregate things and theory, contributing to, hopefully, non-human turn and representational game studies, alongside my work in press on plants and stone in video games. I see this as part of a kind of wider plan project. This is what I call the stuff of games, stuff that mediates play at the level of 3D props and environmental assets. The game concerned with the strangeness of things here speaks to the complex ambivalent infrastructural salience of sand as mediating materiality. Control is a big, rich, fecund game that encourages multiple contrasting readings. Indeed, it supposes as its premise that all paranormal premises are true, basically. And I look forward to David's talk later. But from my perspective, it hooks us first with its eeriness, which Mark Fisher defines as a presence where there should be nothing, or an absence where there should be something, typified by things such as animacy present in the inanimate, or the sense of loss haunting ruins. And I think Control gives us both at once. First, the game's reception has been generally effusive, gushing forth granular descriptions that almost read like Latour's litanies of objects. All the things that are listed in this game are listed almost in the discourse surrounding it. At the same time, however, many note how dizzyingly hard it is to navigate its space. And indeed, destructible environments can make the frenetic possibility space really hard to parse. Much was made in the press of its early use of ray tracing, creating naturalistic surfaces through the hard to triangulate bouncing of light through an environment. However, sticky frame rate is something multiple critics note keeps cropping up, often in the same breath and same language as frustration with the opacity of the game's narrative. This game seems to generate friction, sometimes pleasurable friction, but also interrupts flow at both the level of world building and hardware. What then might we make of this strange, gritty materiality that has players interrupted, lost, and decentered? Game Studies has been accused by Keogh and Murray of marginalizing the visuality that fascinates journalists and players. And August's orientation towards things and games is largely manifested in platform studies analysis of the substructure of games, the invisible things like Altus, Studio, August himself, Montfort, rather than games' representation of things. However, as Keogh, Murray, and Annie will argue, games' visuality offers powerful aesthetic, ideological, and embodied experiences. Visual surfaces are significant when code is predominantly encountered as visual assets. Moreover, surfaces mediate the world, thus more than superficial, I think. and as Anusas argues. Indeed, Roger Calwau's last book concerned the natural aesthetics of stone, of all things, its non-human creative capacities. Indeed, a turn in his work which he called the mysticism of matter. Here, I think we see this manifested in The Oldest House. Affective surfaces provide the material for discussing the relationship of things, which manifest eerily as a texture of play, where the interiors of objects and code remain a little mysterious. Visually, Control is fascinated with stony surfaces, from polished slabs to rough fluted walls, the physics-based rendering of materials and their deformation. Concrete chunks cleave and surfaces shimmer. Here, the player character's telekinesis exemplifies the strange suffusion of play with materiality, with the ability to rip hunks of concrete into the air at the tap of a shoulder button, a strangely fluid but also distanced, kind of spooky form of touch for the player video game cyborg. Indeed, we feel friction and texture audiovisual haptically as the object is dragged through the intervening materials and bodies before we plunge it back into the environment. As August argues, it might be a bit arrogant to think we can fully grasp what an object, a non-human object, is. And it is productively world-shattering to realize how vast objects and their relationships can be. The unfathomable history of an object, or the scale of its kin, can boggle the mind, and each attempt to penetrate the surface of an object generates new surfaces. If we can see the world in a grain of sand, it's also true, as Harman says, that, quote, a pebble can destroy an empire if the emperor chokes at dinner, unquote. As Bennett has it, things can produce a gestalt shift in seeing how matter coheres and how matter matters, as Barrett would have it. And I think play is fundamentally concerned with mediating and changing our perception of what matters. I'm interested in a what I call a soft version of object-oriented ontology, or OO, as it's called, the loose school of Harman, Morton, et al., built on radically decentering anthropocentric worldviews by speculating on worldviews with non-human objects at their center. However, I disagree with some core premises. I dispute Harman's idea of the coherence and the non-relative objectivity of objects, which is quite core to their thesis. Mainly because, after all, humans name these objects, we identify them, we decide their limits in ways which presupposes our conclusions. But there are vast finitudes of relationships which we are unaware of and cannot access from our anthropocentric bubble without having to presuppose a kind of withdrawal or separate, ineffable quality of the object that is unknown to any other object. They exist with faces which we will never see at the same time as their other faces. Things in Control have powers that speak to these ineffable relationships, and it's much to be gained from troubling the hierarchy of subject and object. Bill Brown, in his foundational thing theory, describes things as the latency and excessive character of objects. And I'm much more interested in thing theory as a frame, and its ecological and political entanglements. Latour maintains that objects are mediators of energy rather than transparently and passively instrumental. As Daniel Miller argues, things make people as much as the other way around, and we need not anthropocentrically reduce objects to subjects. For Brown, thingness is an uncanny potentiality that inheres in objects, somewhere between animacy and inanimacy. Thinking with the Eerie, this is a failure of absence, a gestalt shift when something appears as if from nowhere. A concrete slab is a projectile in waiting. An expensive computer is always just an expensive paperweight, biding its time. Stiegler argues, in our time of hyper-industrialism, we are experiencing the industrialization of all things. We've lost the individuality of self through the loss of the individuality of commodity objects that produce us. But Brown notes things' capacity to erupt as, quote, cracks in time's homogeneity, unquote, such as an encounter with an obsolete technology and Control that suggests a different present was possible. Control is interested in the haunting strangeness of things. It's 1960s mise en scène of CRTs, typewriters, and bakelite phones. Few are objects of power, which allow the player to feel out things and things like connections, like telekinetically ripping concrete from the fabric of buildings, which you can do at any time, anywhere. Many more of these things are altered items that erupt with strange powers that resist us. But most are generic assets, which are no less lively. Set dressing exploding and deforming with captivating detail takes center stage, haunting us with their serial repetitions and catching us with their reflections and anachronisms. The Bureau operates to manage things, to contain it, but with the enemy infection, it regularly exceeds this containment. Yet the escape tunnel might be as dark as the prison. Obsolete, malfunctioning objects become things. They're materially exposed by defamiliarization, like a broken tool, for example. Things are objects with their own strange agency, such as a mannequin that duplicates itself, a pram on the left that respires endless smoke, it can't be stopped, and an old fridge that threatens violence if unobserved. Altered items then emblematize the hidden depths of everyday objects, like concrete. As Bennett captures what I think of as kind of the eeriness of things, quote, materiality is both too alien and too close for humans to see clearly, unquote. Breaking concrete free from its foundations lets us see a little bit of its eerie thingness. Rather than thinking with the network of actor network theory or the highly individuated and sterile focus on objects as somehow removed or ineffable in hard ooh, I prefer the metaphor of a kind of messy aggregate of things as a way of colliding these schemas. Sand is both granular and divisible, but also sticky and gritty. And sand is vague as an aggregate in an ontological sense, speaking to the impossibility of a unitary object. Who can say when a heap ends and the dune begins? So it combines perhaps something of the ineffable and the relational. Entanglement with control's metamorphic sand constitutes eerie aggregations in what Ivino and Opperman highlight as the vast networks of material agencies. Globally, we use 50 billion tons of sand per annum, binding it to make concrete and melting it to make silicon and glass. You might think of our age as a digital one, but we proliferate concrete and glass at incomprehensible rates, building the equivalent of 8 New York cities every year. Wieser and Siever describe it as an elusive material that falls to our fingers, but is hardened into more than we realize. The sand economy constitutes a hyperobject in Morton's sense, a vast and pervasive mesh that defies rational understanding to the extent that we've produced enough concrete to cast the entire planet. And we live in a strange world where Saudi Arabia is worried about running out of usable sand. It has to do with the difference between beach sand and desert sand. As Brown argues, we become aware of the things of objects when they stop working for us, or when they become momentarily visible in their own terms, exposing hidden relationships. Like when sand ceases to be a beach or a building and becomes stuck on our toes, or fragments flying and tessellating through the oldest house, the trace of a terrifying economy. Unlike the playful ephemerality of sand in sandcastles, or the fluid orientalist spills and slides of sand in Journey, control foregrounds the socio-historical specificity of sand's technicity through brutalist concrete, main ingredient of which is sand. When Forty argues that concrete is characterized by a strange ambivalence as ancient modern and synthesized natural, this speaks to both the disorienting temporality of sand that sediments and erodes in 200 million year cycles, and the recent nostalgia and Instagram aesthetics for failed brutalist utopias, as highlighted by Holleran and Mold. Rena Banham framed brutalism as an architecture of structural honesty and utilitarian monumentality. But many of these social housing structures proved hard to maintain and often labyrinthine, like these examples are quite confusing buildings to navigate. While in the late 1960s, public works concrete became associated with ugliness and authoritarianism, in recent years, brutalism has become a hauntologist specter of a possible egalitarian and anti-consumerist world. When our reality is one of entrapment in brutal networks of roads, silicon, and unregulated global markets. To quote Gisello, the 21st century promises freedom, promises mobility without freedom, unquote, exemplified by the concrete motorway, whose rampant development and expansion displaces and displacements marks toxification and isolation as much as connection, while much of the welfare housing in the 60s is crumbling back into sand and ruin. Control here puts the strange ontology of sand-based materials into conversation with what Galloway calls neoliberalism's controlling systems of protocol, and Deleuze terms societies of control, built on modulating bodies rather than containing them. The post-war West replaced hard power with the illusion of freedom, freedom to work anywhere and any time, but effectively everywhere and all the time. A network society of freedom without change. Deleuze's language, reminiscent of the dynamics of sand, Transition we're experiencing is from prison to computer, but no less confining. Quote, enclosures are molds, distinct castings, but controls are a modulation, like a self-deforming casting that will continuously change from one moment to the other. After the iron and stone prison comes the fluid prison of sand, but nevertheless, the sandy aggregate subtending the soft power of real-world control still manifests as hard power regularly. The necropolitics of the rampant post-70s growth of the American concrete carceral state, housing 20% of the world's prisoners and just 4% of the population by country. That's 2 million people. Eerily, if we sometimes assume we live in a non-violent society, discipline still haunts societies of control. Concrete hasn't disappeared, it's just become too close to see. As we simultaneously juggle the in-game, flexible neoliberal joint contract of janitorial assistant and director of the bureau in control, answering to the board, the player's movement through control space is fluid and halting as we weave around concrete, chasing close to our enemies to catch the health they drop, always seconds from possible death. After 15 minutes, I'm nearly there. With myriad objectives and zero waypoints, we regularly get lost in a neoliberal nightmare of infrastructure between bittersweet dreams of brutalism's discipline. The game of apparent edifice of disciplinary society controls endless offices are actually repeatedly broken with shifting walls, fractal concrete blocks, and distorting shaders. Vertiginous brutalist arenas are intercut with montages of impossible underground housing blocks. We must live in the house that sand built, while it deforms itself around us. In the penultimate level, we're trapped in an interminable internship, fetching coffees, making copies, facing 21st century precarity the lose would call limitless postponements of the society's control, unquote. We don't win in control. Instead, we save a bureaucracy from itself in an endless job of crisis management. We are directed by the board and the building, interfacing with a network that controls us, a self-deforming cast. When IGM's review notes that, quote, paranatural forces at work treat cement and rebar like Lego bricks, unquote, this is precisely the ecological and political crisis of life in neoliberal concrete capitalism. Like the metamorphic qualities of sand, power is both hard and soft, mobile and unyielding. Individual grains are translucent, but cumulatively opaque. To quote the board and again, quote, we are there everywhere. We expect independence, dependence, unquote. Video games connect players to strange silicon machines. As Annabelle writes, they entangle us in a circuit of feeling between their computational systems and the broader systems to which they interface, unquote. In control, this circuit is murky and haunted neoliberalism. Control's fictive assets are affective things, and through the whir, rumble, and particle effects of telekinetic sand, we feel our enmeshment in systems, but eerie ones that we can't fully sense, ones that stick to us and wear us down. Sand might just be quartz, but as Cohen argues, stone can affect limit-breaching intimacy. Its thingness offers us an eerie eruption of the too close to see. Thank you, and sorry for going over. Okay, that brings us to the end of the presentation.